Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is the very first plugin review, which is the thing that many people have suggested that I do, that I actually did want to do, and I haven't started for reasons, and now I'm starting it because I need more videos, so we're going to make more videos, and this is the very first one, and we're doing massive, because of course we are. Let me share. We're actually sweet. Normally, I would say I'm sorry for tiny massive, but we actually have giant massive through the magic of XSplit. And anyway, let's talk about massive. So, this being the very first plugin review, people might be thinking, "Well, oh my god, why? It's massive." Of course, it's massive. This is like the most controversial thing that even exists on my channel. It's only controversy in your mind, though, because I don't actually hate Massive. Massive is very, very good, obviously, provably, for various reasons. I personally think that there are better things, but it does not necessarily mean that Massive is bad, or the things done with Massive is bad. Are bad. One thing I will say, though, that in his plugin reviews, one thing I'm not going to do is talk about stuff like the sound engine or the quality and anti-aliasing and that kind of thing. Like, even if any of that mattered, which I personally don't think it does, the only thing I care about when it comes to plugins like this is just pure functionality. What can it do? What can it accomplish? What sounds can it make? And does whatever. That's all that matters to me. And presumably, if you're on my channel, it's kind of what matters to you too. So let's do this. Massive. It's hard to talk about Massive without talking about kind of the joke about it. Not so much that it is a joke, but the joke that, like, oh, you download Massive and you can make EDM kind of thing. And like Massive, the preset culture surrounded Massive, that kind of thing. Massive preset packs that exist everywhere and that kind of thing, just everywhere, forever, for all time. And you might be wondering, though, like, why is that? What's the reason for that? And at this point, it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Massive is one of those plugins where people who are new start out being like, oh, I want to make these sounds. How did they make these sounds? How did the people that I listen to make the sounds that I'm hearing? And the answer to that question is usually stuff like, oh, Native Instruments Massive or Native Instruments FM8, which we'll get to in another video, and that kind of thing. And so that gets to be like, people are using Massive because people heard that other people were using Massive, and then later other people get Massive because they heard that those people use Massive, and so on and so forth. However, this wouldn't be sustainable if it weren't for the fact that Massive is actually very capable and perfectly fine for doing what it does. And what is it that it does? Well, at the heart of Massive is its wavetables, because it is a wavetable synthesizer. It's got, like, along with the wavetables, like the wavetables are kind of like the big main thing about it, but everything else about it is also fully functionally very good subtractive synthesis. We'll talk about how good that is in a minute. But let's talk about the wavetable idea. So, what is a wavetable? Well, a wavetable is essentially a collection of single cycle recordings. Oh, I apologize for my horrible sickness. It's a recording. It's a sequential recording of single cycle waveforms. So, if you were to record a note and you were to record that sound and then look at the waveform and then take a single cycle at the precise exact right note range and then did that for every single one, and then there was and then they made your modulation. It would change each waveform, and then you record the waveforms, and then you take that modulation and then you put it into something like Massive, which can read the table of the waveforms, and it will crossfade between those single cycle waveforms in various ways. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. Wavetable synthesis was around before Massive was around, which, by the way, Massive came out in 2007. I don't know if I mentioned that. But Massive certainly popularized it, which is pretty impressive considering this list of wavetables that it has are the only ones it's ever had. Which actually brings home the point that while Massive, the wavetables themselves are handy, the sounds that you get out of Massive are more about, like, especially the more popular ones, have more been about what you do after the wavetables. So the wavetables, they're broken up into various categories, and they're all pretty sweet. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of these because they illustrate some differences in the things that you might not necessarily think are the same. So by default, you start off with the square, saw table. Basically just crossfades between a saw and a square. So you get your basic waveforms. There's a bunch of others like sine, triangle, that kind of thing. So what you get? You got your basic starting waveforms. And then you have these three big knobs on your oscillators. And the three big knobs are the wavetable position, which just scans through the wavetable. Intensity, which has a varying a bunch of options. You have the bend plus and minus, and then formant, which is a whole thing to itself. And however, spectrum, you might be forgiven for thinking that spectrum is really just a low pass filter. You can actually see though in the upper spectrum here that's really not what it's doing. You can see that it is kind of being a low pass filter, but it's cutting off whole chunks of the waveform, as opposed to being an actual pass. And that's not, and it's kind of like that, but not necessarily the same for other kinds of waveforms as well. Actually, I wanted this one. You can see the intensity waveform on the spectrum mode actually kind of looks like it's its own collection of tables itself. A bunch of weird stuff. So spectrum intensity is specific to each individual table set. And then of course there is the bend plus and minus. I tend to use them, if I'm going to use them, I'm going to use them both at once. You can have bend plus by itself, or you can have bend minus by itself. You might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounded the same both times. And actually, for a visual representation of what it's actually doing, I'm going to open up kind of a more modern version of the wavetable business that is Serum. I'm just going to kind of hide it here. But if we look, it just gets them any table at all. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it matters a little bit. That's fine. And I go get bend plus and minus. This is what the bend plus and minus is doing. It's kind of like squeezing and stretching the waveform. That's more or less what's happening inside Massive. So, that explains intensity. And of course, the formant mode can be a bit odd depending on kind of what you want to do with it. It almost kind of feels like it's doing some kind of weird, I don't know, like RM or AM to the sound, but the result is that it kind of forces it to be in a position of a particular formant location, but that position is fluid. I'm sorry, that's super gross, but anyway, formant can do some neat stuff. And then, of course, there's every table, whatever, and everyone in the universe has heard this table. Entire jokes have been made about modern talking. Did I break it? No, I didn't. Entire jokes have been made about that. In fact, an entire Knife Party album that was called 100% No Modern Talking. But it exists. And if you combine something like that with the bend plus and minus, suddenly whole swaths of sound design makes sense. So once you have your oscillators, you have your 3 oscillators, you can have a combination of whatever tables and that kind of deal. And then you have the next step, which is the filters. You have the link to what filters you can go to. And this is sort of the beginning of where Massive has its real strength. Because you can, like I said, you could do your regular subtractive synthesis stuff, but like the degree and the kind of control you have over what you're doing inside Massive was something that, for the most part, you might have only thought you could do with like external like post-processing. In fact, the name of the game with Massive is that you're able, out of the box, to get sounds that you really only thought you could do with extensive post-processing. And this is mostly because of the tables themselves. And in the early days of my YouTube channel, I used to refer to Massive as being a little bit of a cheat because you kind of start halfway there with your tables. Which I still kind of think is true, but it's less true and it's less of an insult than it was when I initially first said this about Massive. Because honestly, the tables themselves are very dated, and if you just kind of relied on that as being your main modulation, you wouldn't feel very good, just because it doesn't feel very good. But a lot of the more impressive sound design with Massive actually happens afterwards, like I said. And one of the things that happens is freaking the filters. So the filters themselves do your basic expected some stuff. Some things are a bit different, like the band pass, for example, isn't really a band pass. It is actually a high pass and low pass together, which you might be thinking, well, okay, what does that matter? And it matters because if you notice that there's a bandwidth and resonance mode, and if you're thinking about what a bandpass filter normally is, you might be thinking, well, aren't those two things the same thing? And it's not really the same thing, because bandwidth determines how wide the difference between the low pass and high pass is, and then the resonance determines the peak of both the bandpass and high pass. So you end up getting two peaks, which you can't see because I'm blocking the screen. But let's put this over here. Detached. So there's your two peaks, and then that's what and then resonance changes essentially the peaks. So like in the very earliest stage of using a filter, you could actually very easily do the whole yai talking thing, because you two peaks and move them across each other. Pretty straightforward. And then beyond that, you have other stuff like the scream filter. Pretty interesting stuff there. And comb filters and acid filters. The comb filter is comb filter. But the DAF filter, the acid filter are sort of special filters. Double notch and all this kind of stuff. These are all here, and they're all wonderful. And the part where this becomes easier than your typical just regular post-processing is not so much what the filters themselves can do, but how much of it that you can macro. Because the third, well, arguably probably the second most important thing about Massive is how easy it is to link internal automation to everything there is. And it's not just the macros. I personally am more favored of the macros myself, where you can have your macro link to whatever parameter, and then also link to other things that are moving in tandem with your motion. Macros are all fine and good, but you can also have these green guys, which all say LFO right now, but they are either LFO performers or steppers. So you can have a step sequencer, a performer, which basically does your typical kind of automation. You can plan it, and you can throw in a bunch of curves to do a bunch of different things. There's also a bunch of presets. You can load and save them, that kind of thing. You can get a bunch of different sort of modes, and you can put those on stuff as well. Come on. And this allows for a much more complete sound building, not just because of whatever arrangement you're going on, whatever like setup of effects and filters and stuff, but also because you can modulate it, automate it within the same environment. So lots of just huge songs in the past have been made that are just fully just performers inside Massive. Some people liked it so much and preferred it to their own external automation that they would actually just clone the Massive patch to make different phrases, and that's how they made their songs. I'm not into that personally, but other people are, and I can kind of see why. You can also automate stuff like the mix over here, the mix 1-2 kind of thing, and this is super important because you can filter between two different filters and that kind of stuff, and a lot more. Actually, it's kind of a sort of a joke about like, how do I make good sounds in Massive? And like the answer is usually automate everything. It doesn't matter how you're doing it, just change it all. The more stuff you change, the more interesting it sounds. And they're not necessarily wrong about that, but don't worry about it. They're not necessarily wrong about that, but it's just kind of a funny sort of catch-all where you just be like, automate everything, and that's sort of, it'll just make it sound more dense and complex, and you absolutely will, just because you have so many things going on. I did mention effects, and on top of the filters, there's also the actual effects, and then there's also these insert effects, which, while they look like, from this view, they look pretty static, along with the feedback and noise and whatever. The routing is actually very comprehensive. You're able to kind of insert the effects kind of wherever you want to insert them, and you can put the feedback before or after a lot of various stages of the whole signal path, which is it shows you here. And you can also put an insert after the feedback, which is pretty great. And it's a little tiny feedback, and the feedback itself plus split insert. So you're the routing in here and the things you can do here are almost as versatile as what you might have manually doing things in your own DAW with your own effects. Almost. So that's pretty cool. And beyond that, on the global side of things, we're able to control stuff like the overall quality. It's pretty Massive is pretty high quality in terms of like the actual literal specs, which is pretty impressive considering it's a 2007 kind of deal. Although Massive has gone through various updates over time, so it's not as if this is the literal thing that came out in 2007, but it's pretty close to what the original was. So it's a lot more optimized, just put it that way. Has randomness, has settings you can copy and save and whatever. You can change your global tuning, internal BPM if you don't have it linked outside, that kind of thing. Routing is cool. Voicing, you can have up to 64 voices of unison, which is pretty great for doing your, average supersaw kind of thing. And the cool thing about the unison is that not only are you able to sort of have a difference in mode of pitch, but you can also have wavetable position change as well as pad changing. So you can, for pads and stuff, this is pretty powerful things because you can fade between different parts of a wavetable, and your 64 voices will all be very, very different, which enables you to have a lot more control and also a lot less control over how things are going to turn out. Keyboard tracking and this is basically pitch, and then this is your keyboard filter. This is what this is, right? This is just like, yeah. So this allows us to control. This is so interesting. Oh, I see. So this is your pitch control. You can either have no pitch and just be the same pitch forever. I guess if you're making percussive sounds, that could be handy. A user-defined pitch difference, so if you have a higher or lower non-linear pitch, and then you also just have linear pitch, which most things are set up to. Same thing with the keyboard filter, which is on, by the way. The key tracking filters, that means that the filters are actually key tracking. They're key tracking. So if you change your pitch you're playing, the filters are changing with it, the position of the filter. And then up in here, we have our oscillator tab, where we're able to do things like restart stuff via gate, because actually, typically by itself, Massive's has that little bit of randomness going on up on top here, which you can disable here too. But it means that like not everything is going to start at the same time all the time. If you wanted to, just turn on restart via gate, and then you can also determine the starting phase of each waveform individually yourself, or you can just put them all right there, or you can leave it up to Massive by itself. You have vibrato, which is linked up to a macro by default, so you have instant vibrato if I didn't have super unison. So that's neat, I guess. You can set your glide time, and let's see, voicing is where you get your monophonic type of playing style, triggering, and kind of deal with that deal. And then glide time is where you get over here, kind of thing. So the other fun bit of Massive is the modulation oscillator. This is probably, at least in my opinion, one of the more advanced pieces of Massive, and the source of the most confusion I've ever seen out of anyone who ever asked questions about Massive. And that's because of all the things that they can do. It can do a lot. So has 4 different kinds of modulation that it can move onto different things. It has ring modulation, phase modulation, position modulation, and filter FM. So filter FM is pretty self-explanatory. It essentially FMs the filter at a pitch, which right now all this is 0, 0, 0. That's saying that it's essentially, that's the pitch difference, which is just saying it's all the same pitch. So right now the modulation oscillator is audio rate. So it's actually going to modulate the filter at audio rate. Not quite, though, because it only works for the low pass and the high pass filters, I'm pretty sure. I did a test once or twice, and then I believe those are the only ones that it works for. Doesn't work for the notches, the band rejects, the band passes. Doesn't work for any of those, only for the high pass and low pass, which makes sense. Audio rate modulation is a really hard thing to do. And for 2007, that had to blew some minds, just going to say. But and then there's ring mod. Ring modulation is kind of like FM, only instead of modulating pitch, it modulates volume. So you're able to target a ring mod for any of the oscillators. And then there's phase. Now, phase actually just is FM. And this is one of the sources of confusions because people think, well, phase modulation, what do you do with that? Well, as it turns out, digital FM is phase modulation. That's how you do digital FM. If you change the phase of something while you're playing it, you change its pitch. It's kind of like the Doppler effect. It might actually literally be a Doppler effect because if you change the source of the sound relative to your position, it changes pitch. So you're changing the source of the sound, which is what you're doing when you change phase. It changes pitch. So this is how you FM oscillators inside Massive. And it's just like a sine wave or something in here. You don't get to choose what you're modulating it by, but you do get to choose how hard you modulate it and how fast you modulate it. So this means that despite all what Massive is doing, there is actually FM inside Massive, which you can use to FM stuff. And then, of course, you can actually FM the wavetable position, which is pretty cool. And then the feather FM I mentioned. You can only do one of them, or I guess you could do all of them per oscillator. Ha! That's interesting. I could have sworn you couldn't have done that. Oh, rather, you can only do one oscillator per type of modulation. So you can ring modulate one, phase modulate one, or wavetable modulate one. But you can't do FM on all three, for example. And of course, you can only filter FM the filters. There's only two of them, so whatever. Pretty great stuff, and you can do lots of neat stuff with that. And it's a lot of the X-core style sounds are kind of not necessarily only this, but you're gonna need this to do that. There's actually quite a plethora of noise options, which is kind of nice. Things I wouldn't necessarily. It's pretty great. Lots of neat stuff in there. And of course, you might be thinking, well, what if I wanted that to back her up to that, rather change pitch along with everything else? And you can actually just link your keyboard tracking. There's plenty of keyboard tracking. There's actual pitch tracking, velocity tracking, aftertouch tracking, and then release tracking, in case you have a controller that does all this stuff. So you can key track. You can key track the color. I did it backwards. There. So you can have that. That's the kind of control that Massive allows you. It might not be immediately intuitive that you can do that kind of stuff, but you can. Feedback is pretty sweet. It does. It's feedback. And like I said before, you can kind of insert it wherever you want. The inserts themselves have a range of pretty typical effects, but also a couple of not typical effects, like the frequency shifter. Which, when I initially saw that, I was kind of dumbfounded because I'd only ever seen that effect in something like Harmor, because it seems like a very additive effect to do. As it turns out, it's actually something that's pretty common in terms of just circuits and that kind of thing, because I saw a hardware one time and I was like, wow, I'm obviously missing something about how this effect works. And so I don't know how it's done digitally, but apparently it's a much more common effect than I initially anticipated. But utilizing something like this, AU5 swears by it. In fact, this kind of stuff and the fact that there's two filters that you can have in parallel, actual parallel, are reasons why AU5 prefers Massive like this over Serum. Which I'm always going to argue is literally superior, but that's fine, honestly. Both inserts have more or less, by more or less, I mean exactly the same effect list. And you can put them independently in different places. They don't have to go to the same place. In fact, I'm pretty sure they can't go to the same place. Yeah, look at that. That makes sense. And then in your effects tab, there's two different effects slots. This is where you find stuff like distortion and just your typical flangers and phasers and reverb and whatever, including the all-important dimension expander, which is really feels like a basic stereo delay. But has been used to death to widen everything. So there's that. There's also an EQ in the post, which people have even used this to kind of put the final edge of some kind of growly talking thing by using it as a modulation kind of target versus actually as an EQ. But you can do both kind of things up with that. And that kind of thing. I believe I overviewed enough of what's happening in here. Yeah. So, I mean, the tables themselves are interesting, but like the fact that it's a fixed list and it's been the same tables forever, for me seems like a giant failure. But it also just seems kind of intense that even with only that as your backdrop, people have been able to innovate cool sounds with Massive for coming on 9 years. In fact, like every other year, there seems to be some kind of crazy sound design that come out of someone using only Massive, just being like, how does a 9-year-old plugin still come up with new stuff like this? And at the end of the day, though, you can think of it as being a 9-year-old plugin, but some of the techniques and some of the things that it's using in there are way older than 9 years. Like the filter, just filters in general have been there since the dawn of synthesis. And the filters themselves, like, while some of them are interesting and neat in terms of like the kind of automative power it gives you, modulation, connections and macros and that kind of deal. While some of those are like, it's certainly a lot easier to use in older filters, just like the stuff that you do with them and the stuff that you can do with the older filters, it's the same stuff. So while people get all impressed with Massive being as relevant as it is, as it hasn't been for so long, it's really, to me, not so much Massive as it is wavetable synthesis and subtractive synthesis. You're still using the two of them, and Massive's strength is not so much that it does those things, it's that the kind of interconnectivity that allows you to have control over. And I have always been a fan of more control, and I really don't like it when companies dumb stuff down so that it's easier to use. But instead of giving you a whole bunch of stuff that's so just dense with possibility that you're not going to do everything that can be done with it, and for a long time. So that's what's up with Massive. I'm still not going to use it, though, because I can still do better stuff, well, that I want to do with things that I'm better at doing. But that's also the same reason why people are going to keep using Massive, because they can do better stuff with Massive than things that other people use. Like I've mentioned before in other videos about like my criteria for picking a DAW that I want to use, and it comes down to the idea of what can it do that nothing else can do, and what can it do that's easier. Basically, it's functionality. Like, it's all comes down to functionality. And like I said before, I don't care about like comparing tech specs, that sort of thing, unless some of those tech specs are, oh, now we have this thing that means we can do this stuff that you couldn't do before. Then okay, that's important, kind of thing. So like as a wavetable synthesizer, it really doesn't compare to something like Serum, because Serum is, I mean, it's not to mention it's way more modern, so it allows you to do things that you probably wouldn't necessarily been able to do with Massive. Although I'm pretty sure, I have to go look back at my interview with Steve Duda, but Steve Duda was talking about how Serum was originally developed around the time that Massive was released, so that may or may not be true. And not only that, but you can also make your own tables, so that's a big part of just being better. You can kind of hack your way into having more than these tables into Massive. I've never done it myself, but I know that you can. Some people have done some interesting things with that. Beyond that, like the subtractive synthesis qualities of things, of being like the filters, the way they're routed, and the mixing between them, that kind of thing, I can just do all that in post. So I don't necessarily care that a plugin has like that kind of like one-stop, all-in-one environment. That's not as important to me personally as it might be to someone else. But I can see how that totally would be very important, and how it is very impressive that a plugin like this can be so compact, can be so light in CPU usage as well, but still accomplish so much and be as versatile as it is. From the ground up, from the creation of sound, the oscillators themselves, the synthesis of the filters and distortion effects and inserts and routing and that kind of thing, to the control of all of it with the internal LFOs, the step sequencers and the performers and the macros, being able to automate whatever you need to have together. All of that together creates a very powerful, piece of software that's pretty much completely overshadowed by Serum at this point. But I'm not gonna hate on anybody that still wants to use Massive in their productions, because clearly it can still do the work. Anyway, if there's a particular plugin that you want to have reviewed, let me know. And if you have any questions about this, also let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.